The Blue Angels, they are the Navy's crack precision flying team, and boy are they good and boy are they fast.
We learned a lot in the course of the 3 years that I was on the team.
Flying Blue Angel number 4, the slot pilot from Dallas, Texas, Lieutenant Pat Walsh.
And it's a responsibility that we take very seriously to show the American public how professional the Navy can be.
There's a burden that goes with it. And I say that in an optimistic, upbeat, constructive sort of way.
It takes total concentration. That is mentally demanding as well as physically demanding.
There was a spectacular air crash today in Niagara Falls, New York, involving 2 jets flying with the Navy's Blue Angels precision team.
The tragedy of that was something that I held on to, for a long time.
You'll see the aircraft that will begin a new era in the long-standing tradition of fine aircraft flown by the Blue Angels.
No one saw this coming as far as I'm concerned. To transition the team into the F-18, I never expected that to happen. To get to this level of individual performance and team performance, that's a secret sauce. That to me is something that's very powerful. I'm the oldest of 6 from Dallas. My father was in high school coaching, teaching, administration for almost 50 years. We couldn't afford to go to the high school that I wanted to go to, which is where he was coaching and teaching. But because the incentives were for faculty to bring their own kids to school, I got to go to Jesuit. Because of that school, I was able to get into Annapolis. Graduated in '77 from the Naval Academy, and I selected for naval aviation and then went to Pensacola right after graduation. In my class, everybody wanted to fly the F-14 and the space shuttle. There was nothing less that they would accept. Due to circumstances beyond my control, I couldn't stay on the flight schedule because my tonsils were inflamed all the time, and the flight surgeon said, we got to rip those out. So at age 23 or so, I'm getting my tonsils taken out. My cohort advances without me, and none of them get what they want in terms of selection. They all wanted jets. They ended up in other communities. When I'm finally back on the flight schedule and I reach this threshold where it's time now to decide where we're going to go and what we're going to do, the flight instructor for my final flight before selection, Jim Alexander, said, hey, do you want to fly jets? I go, oh yeah, I really do. Amazingly, come back after that flight with this amazing grade point average, and by 1,000th of a point, I get to fly jets. A7s out of Lemoore is where I started and was assigned to VA 192, world famous, super shit hot Golden Dragons. We were part of a 2-carrier strategy at the time. I remember putting away Christmas presents when we started workups and then buying Christmas presents when it was finally over. I completed my first operational tour in November of 1982 and then moved over to Air Test and Evaluation Squadron 5. And while I was at Air Test and Evaluation Squadron 5, that's when I realized I had the time and experience to apply for the Navy Flight Demonstration Team, so the Blue Angels, and applied in 1984. You know, you've opened the door to something big and amazing when you're selected and everybody's shaking your hand. You haven't done anything yet. You haven't put on a uniform, and yet everybody's excited for you. And that's because the people before you have laid the groundwork for this professional organization, world renowned, and you get to be part of that group. So it's a pretty amazing experience. Started out as number 3 on the left wing. The first winter training, I remember more than anything else that we would go 13 days on and take 1 day off, and that we would fly twice and sometimes more than that a day in order to get to a level of performance that the team recognized was our standard. And we weren't going to settle for anything less. So if we had shortfalls, if we had shortcomings in any maneuver, we'd go back in the air. We'd spend a lot of time talking about it in the brief. We would spend twice as much time talking about it in the debrief. But at the end, we would still have to be able to perform. And it didn't really matter where Didn't really matter what kind of weather or conditions that we were flying in, we had to perform. Particularly with the A-4, it was such a rock solid, steady airplane to fly. You could get really close to the point where other airplanes can sort of feel you because of just the disturbed air around the fuselage, because we're working in that kind of tight space. But the signature maneuver for the Diamond would be the opening maneuver, which is the Diamond 360. I remember coming up Boss Pearson's wing line and generated a lot of confidence in the formation when we would fly with him. And I'd get to a point where I could hear a change in the whine of the engine. And whatever distance that was, that's today's distance. You just kind of hold that spot and hold on to that position for 30, 40 seconds or so. And then we ease it out and we'd get around for another maneuver. Anything over the water would be really good conditions for the formation. The San Francisco show was always a favorite because the air was dense and it was nice and smooth, and we could really have a close, tight formation. There was a mid-air collision at the Niagara Falls show. It was a really, really, really tough day for us as a family.
The two planes fell in flames after the collision. One of the pilots was killed, the other parachuted to safety.
It's important to recognize that all of us walked away from that experience feeling like we had some responsibility and accountability that we had to hold ourselves up to. Mike Gershon was a great American. He was a really, really good friend. He was a loving husband and a brand new dad. And the tragedy of that was something that I held on to for a long time. It was tough because all of our procedures are based on all six being there. So there were communications that we would have to continue because we couldn't change the cadence at that point. We couldn't change the way that we were communicating, meaning that there was a certain sort of rhythm that comes with each flight, each check-in, and the check-in for each maneuver. And the absence of Mike's voice on there was something that we couldn't just ignore it. It was the sort of thing that we were reminded of the mishap every time we flew, every time we had a maneuver, every time we checked in, where I still feel connected to that day and that family because of it. We wrap up the '85 season and transition and bring on Gil Rood, who comes in as the flight leader, the boss. I was a slot pilot in '86 and stayed with the slot position in '87. The measure of success is, no surprises at work. It's to keep the wingtips away from each other. It's to help pilots that are ahead of me, number 2 and number 3, to feel comfortable with the formation that they're flying, or give them feedback if necessary, or in the case of a safety maneuver, in order to get an airplane away from another one.
From the left, the Blue Angels, 1986.
One aspect of all the things that are going on is the recognition that the A-4 is going to sunset. And now, how are we going to transition? We complete the '86 season with 6 A-4s, and as we taxi back after the completion of that, Cliff Skelton, our number 7, who had come from VFA 106, taxis an F-18 now to meet Boss. This is a unique time in the sense that the F-18 only has 2 deployments. So the mandate that we had from the Secretary of the Navy was that you accept these pre-production airplanes as is, that there's no alterations to the airplane, substantial, and requiring a lot of money and resources. And that the justification for the transition to the F-18 was that these airplanes couldn't fly anywhere else in the fleet. They're pre-production, which means that they're going to sit or they're going to be in the training mode. So if the Blues can use them, then we're going to use them. And you have to do this within a normal show season turnaround. So we can't take a year off to go figure this out. We have a fairly compressed period of time. And little did we know in November of 1986 that we'd still be flying the F-18 today. So remember, in the A4, if you move the stick, then there's going to be mechanical linkages that connect right to hydraulic ports that move hydraulic fluid back and forth. And the airplane is very responsive. If you look at the bottom of the stick where that connection would typically be, in the case of the F-18, there's wires. Those wires go to a flight control computer. That flight control computer senses what you're asking for. And it says, you want to go left? Well, I can help you. And I'm going to make that turn as efficient as possible. And what that means is the airplane is constantly trimming itself for 1G flight. We lost a lot of horizontal authority because we were biasing this digital flight control system, trying to get it to do something it wasn't designed to do. And there's a guy at Patuxent River, he looks like Spencer Tracy. He's been there 30 years. He goes, I can figure this out. And he goes to Ace Hardware and he gets a spring. And he attaches the spring, from the stick to the floorboard of the airplane. And what that does for us is it allows us now to get into formation flying at a relatively early stage in winter training as we transition. And it answers the question that we were trying to answer, which is, how are we going to fly formation in the F-18? Because of the timeline that we were on, which was effectively the end of season 86 to first show in the spring of 87, we did not know whether or not the F-18 could do the complete A4 show. So that was part of our syllabus, was to go at each maneuver now with a new airplane, with pilots that had some experience in the positions they were in, and they could evaluate whether or not this would work. So one example was the diamond dirty roll in the A4. And when we tried to do that with just 2 airplanes in the F-18, it was pretty clear that the disturbed air pattern, once the flaps were down, were so large that it created instability within the formation, and we just couldn't do it. And that's how we decided to go vertical. So we go vertical with a dirty loop in a way that really highlights what the Hornet does best, which is raw power. And to be able to do that as a flight of 4, there's no other team that does that. So the first air show is at El Centro and then at Yuma. I think we present the airplane in a way that the fleet is pretty excited about it. We would hear from a number of guys in the fleet that, hey, the airplane can do a lot more than this. And that was just fine, because the purpose of what we were doing was just simply trying to make the transition and to establish a foundational baseline. We learned what the limitations were of an airplane that the fleet was still learning how to operate. And I think in time, what happens is succeeding teams become more and more confident with the airplane that they're flying, and they can test it in different maneuvers and formations that really highlight the performance characteristics of the airplane. So when you think about what it took for pilots to transition from the A4 to the F-18, now maintainers have to do that, and they've got to do it in a way where they're staying faithful to the mission as far as the requirements are concerned, to never lose an air show because of maintenance. And at the same time, they've got to now adapt to a very new set of flight controls, of hydraulic systems, a completely different engine as far as the maintenance is concerned. Quite agile. And I tell you, when I was in the fleet afterwards, I used to look for people on the team and I would pull them to my squadron because they had that kind of reputation. So I flew the F-18A through D, and we're looking at E, F, and G versions that are out in the fleet today. I didn't have an opportunity to fly it, but man, they represent us well. The pilots, the maintainers, they're all really, really sharp. They do a great job with the performance. They do a great job with the crowd line. They do a great job representing the best that the Navy has to offer. And I'm just proud to say that I used to do this.